In 1258, Baghdad was the richest city on earth, the jewel of Islamic civilization. 1 million people lived in climate-controlled comfort, studying in the world's greatest library, walking through perfumed gardens irrigated by a 3,000-year-old canal system that turned the desert into paradise. The city produced more books than all of Europe combined. Its hospitals performed eye surgery. Its schools taught algebra. Then the Mongols arrived. In just 40 days, they didn't just destroy a city, they destroyed an entire civilization's life support system. They demolished irrigation networks that had functioned since Babylon. They turned the birthplace of agriculture back into barren desert. And here's the most insane part. Iraq never recovered. That's not hyperbole. The population of Iraq didn't return to pre-Mongol levels until the 1970s. That's 700 years to recover from 40 days of destruction. This isn't just another Mongols killed everyone story. This is about how they systematically dismantled 5,000 years of accumulated human engineering, destroyed the most sophisticated irrigation system on Earth, and turned the Fertile Crescent, literally where farming was invented, into a wasteland. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Iraq went from feeding the ancient world to barely feeding itself, why the desert expanded by thousands of square miles, and how 40 days of Mongol rage erased 50 centuries of human progress. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we need to understand what Baghdad and Mesopotamia were before 1258. This wasn't just another medieval city. Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, was where humans invented civilization. The Sumerians built the first cities here 5,000 years ago. The Babylonians created the first laws. The Assyrians built the first libraries. For 5 millennia, this land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was the most continuously productive agricultural region on Earth. How? Irrigation. But not just any irrigation, the most complex water management system in the ancient world. Starting around 3000 BCE, every civilization that controlled Mesopotamia added to this network. Sumerian canals fed into Babylonian aqueducts, which connected to Assyrian reservoirs, which linked to Persian qanats, which joined Sassanid weirs, which merged with Islamic distribution systems. By 1258, it was a 5,000-year-old machine with millions of moving parts, all working in perfect harmony. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from Baghdad, had perfected this system to an art form. They had a government ministry just for water management, the Diwan al-Ma. Thousands of engineers maintained the canals. Each district had watermasters who controlled flow rates down to the gallon. They had detailed schedules for which fields got water on which days. Legal codes specified water rights down to individual trees. It was so sophisticated that they could predict and prevent floods years in advance. This system supported a population density that seems impossible for medieval times. The area around Baghdad, a region that today is mostly desert, supported 20 million people in 1258. 20 million. They grew wheat, barley, rice, dates, citrus, cotton, sugarcane. They had orchards of pomegranates, figs, apricots. The land was so productive that Arab geographers called it the bride of the earth. One scholar wrote that you could walk from Basra to Mosul, 500 miles, and never leave the shade of palm trees. Baghdad itself was a marvel that made European cities look like mud puddles. Founded in 762 CE as a perfectly circular city, by 1258 it had grown to over 1 million inhabitants. It had free public hospitals, bimaristans, with specialized wards for different diseases. The Mustansiriya University had 3,000 students studying everything from theology to medicine to mathematics. The House of Wisdom contained 400,000 books. This when the largest library in Christian Europe had maybe 400. The city's infrastructure was mind-blowing. They had air conditioning, wind catchers and underground water channels that could drop indoor temperatures by 20 degrees. They had sewage systems with running water, street lighting using oil lamps, paved roads with drainage, public baths with heated floors, mechanical clocks in every neighborhood. This was a city that had solved problems Europe wouldn't even identify for another 500 years. The wealth was staggering. Baghdad's annual tax revenue was 30 million gold dinars, more than all of European kingdoms combined. The caliph's palace had a tree made of gold and silver with mechanical birds that sang. Visiting ambassadors described fountains of rose water, walls covered in Chinese silk, floors of marble so polished you could use them as mirrors. The markets sold goods from India, China, Africa, and Europe. It was the center of the world economy. But it wasn't just material wealth. Baghdad was Earth's intellectual capital. Scholars there had preserved Greek and Roman knowledge that Europe had lost. They'd translated everything from Aristotle to Galen into Arabic, then expanded on it. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra here. Al-Razi wrote the most advanced medical texts of the age. Ibn al-Haytham founded the scientific method. They were doing cataract surgery while Europeans were bleeding people for headaches. The cultural output was extraordinary. Baghdad produced more books per year than were copied in all of Europe. They had a street just for booksellers, 100 shops selling everything from poetry to engineering manuals. They had paper mills. Europe was still using expensive parchment. Professional authors could make a living just from writing. There were lending libraries where common people could borrow books for free. This was the city Hulagu Khan approached in January 1258 with 150,000 Mongol warriors. The Mongols had been destroying cities for 50 years, but Baghdad was supposed to be different. It was the capital of Islam, the seat of the Caliph, who was technically the leader of all Muslims. It was also supposedly impregnable. Massive walls, a river on one side, canals that could be flooded for defense. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, had 50,000 troops and could call on hundreds of thousands more from across the Islamic world. But al-Mustasim made a fatal miscalculation. He believed Baghdad's spiritual significance would protect it. When Hulagu demanded surrender, the Caliph sent insulting messages back, saying the entire Muslim world would rise up if Baghdad was threatened. He was wrong. The Muslim world was divided, and many rulers secretly hoped Baghdad would fall so they could claim leadership of Islam. Hulagu's approach was methodical and horrifying. First, he destroyed every town approaching Baghdad, creating a refugee crisis that swelled the city's population to nearly 2 million, double its capacity. Then he systematically destroyed the irrigation channels feeding the city, not just blocking them, but demolishing them so completely they couldn't be quickly repaired. Baghdad began to starve before the siege even started. The Mongols reached Baghdad's walls on January 29, 1258. The Caliph finally realized his mistake and tried to negotiate. Hulagu's terms were simple: surrender unconditionally, or everyone dies. The Caliph tried to buy him off, offering treasure that would make any king rich for life. Hulagu responded by beginning the bombardment. The Mongols had Chinese siege engineers with them who'd built advanced catapults and something new: early cannons using Chinese gunpowder technology. They didn't just attack one section of wall, they surrounded the entire city and attacked from all sides simultaneously. The psychological effect was devastating. Citizens couldn't flee because there was nowhere to run. The bombardment continued day and night without pause. But here's where Hulagu showed his true evil genius. He didn't just want to conquer Baghdad, he wanted to erase it. While bombarding the walls, he had other troops systematically destroying every irrigation channel, every dam, every weir for 50 miles around Baghdad. He wasn't just cutting off water to the city, he was dismantling infrastructure that had taken 5,000 years to build. February 5th, the walls were breached. The Caliph, seeing destruction was imminent, tried one more negotiation. He would surrender the city, give up all treasures, if Hulagu would spare the people and the infrastructure. Hulagu agreed. On February 10th, al-Mustasim and his entire family came out to surrender. Hulagu had them wrapped in carpets and trampled to death by horses. Mongol tradition said royal blood shouldn't touch the ground, so this was their respectful way of executing royalty. Then Hulagu revealed his lie. He ordered his troops to kill everyone and destroy everything. What happened over the next 40 days was one of the most complete destructions of a city in human history. But it wasn't random violence. It was systematic annihilation. Hulagu divided Baghdad into sectors and assigned each to different Mongol units with specific destruction quotas. They had to kill a certain number of people and destroy a certain amount of infrastructure to meet their targets. The killing was methodical. They started with anyone who could read or write: scholars, teachers, students, even merchants who kept ledgers. The entire faculty of the Mustansiriya University was executed. Every student was killed. They made a pyramid of 90,000 skulls just from academics. They specifically targeted anyone with technical knowledge: engineers, architects, doctors, even skilled craftsmen. They were erasing not just people, but expertise. Then came the books. The Mongols threw the entire contents of the House of Wisdom into the Tigris River. Contemporary accounts say the river ran black with ink for 6 months. 400,000 manuscripts. Greek philosophy, Islamic science, Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, all destroyed. Survivors said you could walk across the Tigris on books like a bridge. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, gone in hours. But throwing books in the river wasn't enough. They burned every library, every school, every private collection. They hunted down private scholars and burned their personal libraries in front of them before executing them. They destroyed the paper mills so no new books could be made. They killed everyone who knew how to make paper. They even destroyed the printing blocks and movable type that Islamic craftsmen had been experimenting with. Technology that wouldn't appear in Europe for another 200 years. The hospitals were specifically targeted. The Mongols didn't just kill the doctors and patients. They destroyed all medical equipment and burned all medical texts. The Bimaristan of Baghdad had medical records going back 500 years, tracking diseases, treatments, outcomes, all destroyed. Surgical instruments that were more advanced than anything in Europe melted down. The pharmaceutical gardens where they grew medicinal plants burned and salted. The destruction of people was beyond comprehension. Contemporary estimates range from 800,000 to 2 million killed in 40 days. Let's think about that. At the low estimate, that's 20,000 people per day. Every day, for 40 days. Men, women, children, elderly, no one was spared. They killed until they got tired of killing. One Mongol general complained his men's arms were exhausted from swinging swords. The Mongols had different killing methods for different social classes, like a grotesque menu of death. Nobles were wrapped in carpets and trampled. Merchants were locked in their shops and burned alive. Craftsmen had their hands cut off and were left to bleed out. Women and children were divided among the troops as slaves, but so many were taken that the price of slaves crashed across the Mongol Empire. You could buy a human being for the price of a dog. But here's what made this genocide different from other Mongol massacres: the infrastructure destruction. Hulagu understood that Baghdad's power came from its irrigation system. So while his men killed the people, his engineers were systematically destroying every piece of water infrastructure they could find. And I mean every piece. They didn't just breach dams. They demolished them stone by stone. They didn't just block canals. They filled them with rubble and corpses so they could never be cleared. They destroyed the survey markers that showed water flow patterns collected over millennia. They burned the archives that contained maintenance records going back to Sumerian times. They killed every water engineer, every canal worker, everyone who knew how the system worked. The destruction went far beyond Baghdad. The Mongols spent months after the siege systematically destroying irrigation infrastructure throughout Mesopotamia. They demolished the Narawan Canal, a 200-mile masterwork that had irrigated central Iraq for 700 years. They destroyed the ancient weirs on the Diyala River that controlled flooding. They wrecked the distribution systems that allocated water between regions. But the most catastrophic destruction was of the upstream infrastructure. The entire Mesopotamian irrigation system depended on controlling seasonal floods from mountain snowmelt. This required constant maintenance of channels, embankments, and overflow systems. The Mongols destroyed all of it. Without this control, the rivers returned to their natural state: massive floods in spring, dry channels in summer. The first flood season after the Mongol destruction was apocalyptic. With no controlled channels, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded randomly. Former farmland became swamps. Swamps became deserts. Salt from lower layers of soil came to the surface, poisoning the land. Areas that had been farmed for 5,000 years became permanently barren. The desert began advancing into what had been the most fertile region on Earth. Disease followed destruction. The Mongols had thrown so many bodies into the canals and rivers that the water supply was contaminated. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread through surviving populations. The swamps, created by uncontrolled flooding, became breeding grounds for malaria mosquitoes. Plague followed, killing many of those who'd hidden from the Mongols. The ecological destruction was irreversible. You see, Mesopotamian soil is naturally salty. Only constant irrigation with proper drainage keeps it farmable. Once the irrigation system failed, salt accumulated rapidly. Within a decade, vast areas were too salty to grow anything. The palm groves died, the orchards withered. The famous gardens of Baghdad became dust bowls. The Mongols also destroyed the social knowledge needed to rebuild. They'd killed everyone who understood the irrigation system. Not just the engineers, but the farmers who knew planting cycles, the officials who managed water rights, the workers who performed maintenance. This knowledge, accumulated over 5,000 years and passed down through generations, was gone. Even if someone wanted to rebuild, they wouldn't know how. Wildlife that had been controlled for millennia returned with a vengeance. Lions, driven out by agriculture, reclaimed abandoned farmland. Wolves multiplied in the ruins. The carefully maintained balance between human civilization and nature collapsed. Mesopotamia reverted to wilderness, but a damaged wilderness, not pristine nature but scarred wasteland. The economic collapse was total. Baghdad had been the center of Indian Ocean trade, the link between East and West. That ended instantly. Trade routes that had functioned for 2,000 years shifted north to the Mongol-controlled Silk Road or south to Egypt. The currency collapsed. The banking system, which had invented checks and letters of credit, ceased to exist. Economic innovations that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries were lost. The demographic collapse was even worse than the immediate deaths. Without irrigation, the land could only support a fraction of its former population. Survivors fled to Syria, Egypt, Anatolia. Entire tribes that had lived in Mesopotamia for millennia migrated away and never returned. The Arabic dialect of Iraq changed because so much of the population was replaced by nomadic peoples who moved into the vacuum. Within a generation, Mesopotamia went from the most densely populated region in the Middle East to one of the least. Archaeologists have found entire cities that were simply abandoned after 1258, never to be inhabited again. The total population fell from around 20 million to less than 2 million. It would take 700 years, until the 1970s, for Iraq's population to recover to pre-Mongol levels. The Mongols tried to govern what remained, but there was nothing to govern. They installed puppet rulers in Baghdad, but the city never recovered its significance. When Ibn Battuta visited in 1327, 70 years after the destruction, he found mostly ruins. He wrote that Baghdad was like a dream that has passed and a tale that is told. The few inhabitants lived in the rubble of former grandeur. Later rulers tried to rebuild the irrigation system but failed. The Ottomans, who controlled Iraq from 1534 to 1918, made multiple attempts. They brought in engineers, allocated funds, conscripted workers. But they were trying to rebuild something when the instruction manual had been thrown in the river. They could build individual canals but couldn't recreate the integrated system. Every attempt failed. The British, who took over after World War I, were shocked by how empty Iraq was. They'd read classical accounts of Mesopotamian fertility and found desert. British engineers in the 1920s estimated that recreating the pre-Mongol irrigation system would cost more than building the Suez Canal. Even with modern technology, they couldn't figure out how some of the ancient systems had worked. The environmental damage compounded over centuries. Without proper irrigation, soil salinity increased every year. Areas that might have been recoverable in 1300 were irreversibly damaged by 1400. The desert expanded relentlessly. By the 20th century, dust storms from land that had once been paradise were reaching Europe. The intellectual dark age was just as lasting. Islamic science never recovered from losing Baghdad. The Islamic Golden Age ended in those 40 days. Centers of learning shifted to Cairo and Damascus, but they never matched Baghdad's output. The loss of texts was catastrophic, Works by ancient Greeks only known through Arabic translations were gone forever. Medical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries was lost. Think about what might have been. Baghdad in 1258 was developing movable type, experimenting with gunpowder, investigating optics, performing advanced surgery. If the trajectory had continued, the Islamic world might have had the printing press 200 years before Gutenberg, firearms before Europe, the scientific revolution starting in Iraq instead of Italy. The Mongol destruction didn't just destroy what was, it destroyed what could have been. The psychological trauma created cultural changes that persist today. The complete destruction of Baghdad created a deep conservatism in Islamic culture. Why innovate when everything you build can be destroyed? The flourishing intellectual culture that had characterized early Islam was replaced by defensive traditionalism. The openness to foreign ideas that had made Baghdad great was replaced by suspicion of outsiders. The Mongol destruction also broke the Arab world's confidence. Before 1258, Arabs saw themselves as the inheritors and improvers of all previous civilizations. After 1258, they saw themselves as victims. The narrative changed from, "We preserve and advance human knowledge," to, "We survive despite constant threats." This victim mentality, born from very real victimization, shaped Middle Eastern politics for centuries. Modern Iraq still suffers from the Mongol destruction. The country's water problems, disputes with Turkey over dams, declining river flow, increasing salinity, all trace back to 1258. The original irrigation system worked because it was managed as a single unit from source to sea. Since the Mongol destruction, it's been fragmented between different nations and regions, none of whom fully understand the system they inherited ruins of. The population distribution never recovered its pre-Mongol pattern. Ancient cities remain buried in sand. Regions that supported millions now support thousands. The demographic center of the Arab world shifted permanently to Egypt and the Levant. Iraq, which had been the core of Islamic civilization, became a periphery, a backwater, a place where glory used to be. Let me give you specific examples of what was lost. The Mongols destroyed a Sassanid-era dam system that prevented Tigris floods from destroying farmland. That system was never rebuilt. Today, the Iraqi government spends millions annually on flood control that the ancient system handled automatically. They destroyed qanat systems, underground channels that brought mountain water to dry areas. These required precise engineering to maintain the correct slope over dozens of miles. The knowledge of how to build them was lost. Modern engineers with GPS and lasers struggle to recreate what medieval Persians did with string and water levels. The Nahrawan Canal, which the Mongols destroyed, irrigated an area that supported 5 million people. Today, that same land supports maybe 50,000. Not because we can't build canals, we can build bigger ones, but because the Nahrawan was part of an integrated system. It worked in harmony with dozens of other canals, with seasonal flood patterns, with soil types, with crop rotations developed over millennia. Destroying it was like removing your heart and expecting your body to work with just a mechanical pump. The House of Wisdom contained books we know existed only from references in other works. Histories of ancient civilizations, scientific treatises, philosophical works. Al-Razi had written 200 books on medicine. We have 20. Ibn Sina's works on physics and optics, gone. Al-Kindi's translations of Greek philosophers, destroyed. Mathematical proofs that scholars reference but can't find. The full text of the 1001 Nights in its original form. Maps of trade routes to places we can't identify. Technological manuals for devices we can't recreate. Some of the destroyed books contained the only copies of ancient works. Babylonian astronomical observations spanning 2,000 years, used to predict eclipses and planetary movements, thrown in the river. Sassanid histories that contained the only records of Central Asian civilizations, gone. Indian mathematical texts that Islamic scholars had translated, destroyed. We know these existed because scholars reference them, quote from them, build on them, but the originals are gone forever. The medical knowledge lost was catastrophic. Islamic doctors had been performing cataract surgery with hollow needles, a technique not rediscovered until the 20th century. They had anesthetics using opium and cannabis in precise doses, knowledge that took centuries to rebuild. They understood infection control, using alcohol and vinegar as disinfectants. They had surgical instruments of specialized steel that Europe couldn't produce until the Industrial Revolution. All of this knowledge, the techniques, the recipes, the procedures, died with the doctors of Baghdad. The agricultural knowledge was equally irreplaceable. They knew exactly when to plant each crop based on star positions and river levels. They had developed wheat varieties adapted to high salinity. They knew which fields to leave fallow and which years to maintain soil health. They had pest control methods using companion planting and beneficial insects. This wasn't written in books. It was held in the minds of farmers who'd learned from their fathers going back to Sumerian times. When the Mongols killed the farmers, they killed 5,000 years of accumulated agricultural wisdom. Here's a detail that breaks my heart. Among the destroyed books were children's textbooks. Baghdad had schools for common people, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic. These schools used specially designed textbooks with illustrations and simple language. The Mongols burned them all. They burned children's homework, student notebooks, teaching guides. They destroyed the very tools that could have rebuilt civilization. The Mongols even destroyed Baghdad's music. The city had been developing a form of notation to write down musical compositions. They had theoretical works on harmony and rhythm. They had libraries of songs, religious, popular, classical, all destroyed. The instruments themselves, specialized ouds and drums that had evolved over centuries, burned. The craftsmen who knew how to make them, killed. Musical traditions that went back to Babylon, silenced forever. The timeline of destruction is important. This wasn't one bad day, or even one bad week. The Mongols spent 40 days systematically destroying Baghdad, then months destroying the surrounding irrigation infrastructure. They returned seasonally for years to destroy any attempts at rebuilding. When locals tried to repair a canal, the Mongols would return and destroy it again, killing everyone involved in the repair. They made reconstruction impossible. The few survivors who tried to rebuild faced impossible challenges. Imagine trying to recreate the internet after all computers have been destroyed, all programmers killed, all documentation burned, and anyone who tries to learn programming is executed. That's what rebuilding Mesopotamian irrigation was like. The system was so complex, so interconnected, that you couldn't rebuild just part of it. It all had to work together, or none of it worked. The Mongols had help in this destruction. Local tribes who'd been marginalized by urban civilization guided them to hidden libraries, pointed out important engineers, revealed where maintenance records were stored. Short-sighted revenge that doomed their own descendants to centuries of poverty. The Mongols couldn't have been so thorough without local collaboration. Environmental historians now recognize the Mongol destruction of Mesopotamia as one of history's great ecological disasters, comparable to the deforestation of Easter Island or the American Dust Bowl, but worse because it was intentional. The Mongols knew what they were doing. Chinese advisors had told Hulagu that destroying irrigation would prevent the land from supporting rebellion. It was strategic ecological warfare. The first time in history someone deliberately destroyed an entire region's life support system. The ripple effects reached around the world. The destruction of Baghdad's libraries meant European scholars lost access to Arabic translations of Greek works. This may have delayed the Renaissance. The collapse of Baghdad's economy disrupted Indian Ocean trade, impoverishing ports from India to East Africa. The loss of Islamic scientific momentum meant discoveries in optics, chemistry, and medicine were delayed by centuries. How different might world history be if Baghdad had survived? Modern parallels are terrifying. The Mongol destruction of Mesopotamia shows what happens when infrastructure built over millennia meets destructive force. The American bombing of Iraq in 1991 and 2003 damaged some of the same irrigation systems the Mongols destroyed, systems that had been partially rebuilt over centuries. ISIS deliberately destroyed archaeological sites and libraries, continuing the erasure begun in 1258. Each war sets Iraq further back. Each reconstruction fails to reach previous heights. Today's climate change makes reconstruction even harder. The rivers carry less water than in medieval times. The soil is saltier. The desert has advanced. Even with modern technology and oil wealth, Iraq can't support its pre-Mongol population through agriculture. The Garden of Eden, the Fertile Crescent, the birthplace of farming. It's mostly desert now, and the Mongols started that transformation. The numbers are staggering when you add them up. 20 million people reduced to 2 million. 5,000 years of irrigation infrastructure destroyed in 40 days. 400,000 books thrown in a river. A city of 1 million reduced to 100,000. The Islamic Golden Age ended. Scientific advancement set back centuries. The center of world civilization reduced to a provincial backwater. All because Hulagu Khan decided that destruction was easier than governance. But the real tragedy isn't just what was destroyed, it's what was prevented. Every generation since 1258 that could have built on Baghdad's knowledge but couldn't because it was gone. Every scientist who had to rediscover what was already known. Every farmer who struggled with problems that had been solved centuries earlier. Every doctor who couldn't save patients because the treatments were lost. The compound interest of lost knowledge over 750 years is incalculable. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad and Mesopotamia remains history's most complete erasure of a civilization. Other cities have been destroyed. Rome fell, Carthage was razed, Tenochtitlan was conquered. But they were rebuilt, or their knowledge was preserved elsewhere. Baghdad was different. The Mongols didn't just destroy a city or even a civilization. They destroyed an ecosystem that had taken 5,000 years to build and broke it so thoroughly that it has never recovered. So when people talk about the Mongol Empire's religious tolerance or their trade networks, remember Baghdad. Remember the 2 million dead. Remember the libraries burning. Remember the canals filled with corpses. Remember the desert advancing over what was paradise. The Mongols gave us the largest contiguous land empire in history. In exchange, they took away the future that Baghdad was building. A future of science, learning, and prosperity that we're still trying to recreate today. And that's the ultimate lesson of Baghdad's destruction. Civilization is fragile. What takes millennia to build can be destroyed in days. The knowledge of generations can be thrown in a river. The most advanced city on earth can become ruins. And sometimes, what's broken can never be fixed. Iraq has been trying for 750 years. The gardens haven't grown back. The books haven't been rewritten. The dead haven't returned. Paradise lost became paradise destroyed, and the desert remembers nothing of what was.